I wonder if we could start by getting your thoughts on the talks between European leaders in Paris this evening on Ukraine. Their fear is that President Trump is going to rush into a ceasefire deal with President Putin that favours Russia. Do you recognise that fear?
I do recognise that fear, and I think that would be a poor outcome for Europe at this moment in time. I'm also worried by the way in which Witkoff, his negotiator with Putin, has been putting out what I would regard as a Russian narrative. I've said already on a couple of occasions that the worst deal would be an early ceasefire, which makes unnecessary concessions on the Russian side, because Ukraine has been pushed to the table to negotiate, to accept a ceasefire in principle. But we see absolutely no apparent concessions on Putin's part. As far as we can tell, his Ukrainian policy has no reverse gear. He is just asking for the maximum still. So I think that the better outcome would be for us to continue to support the Ukrainians and not to do an early deal which makes concessions to Russia. I mean, Russia's not in a particularly good place, and we need them to be under pressure as well when they agree to a ceasefire. Look, everybody wants to see this war at least stopped, maybe not concluded. So I agree with that objective. But the question is, how do you get Russia to the table?
Before we move on to talking about that very point, can you elaborate on what you mean by Witkoff sort of pushing a Russian agenda?
Well, his public statements seem to reflect Russia's line. And up until, we've seen a significant shift. The Biden administration was very clear in their support for Zelenskyy. They're very clear in how the war started. And you've had some really extraordinary statements coming out of the White House. Maybe we shouldn't take them quite at face value, but to be pro-Putin at this point in time is very dangerous for European security. To allow him to, as it were, come out of this conflict claiming some sort of victory, I think is perhaps almost the worst outcome for Europe, because it raises all sorts of questions for the future about European security.
Do you believe that it's in Russia's interest to agree a ceasefire? Do they actually want a ceasefire?
Well, the strange thing is, I think Russia probably needs a ceasefire rather badly, more than Putin himself realizes. The war has been a disaster. His leadership must be under question amongst the privileged kleptocrats around him who are not getting the deal that they expected. They have significant economic and cash problems. Their cash reserves are running out. And the experts who analyze the military situation tell me that the Russian military is at a point where its future performance is likely downwards. Less motivation of its soldiers, less ammunition, less equipment on the battlefield. I mean, ironically, Putin may actually be playing into the West's hands by saying, well, I'm going to accept a ceasefire, but doing nothing about it. And look at the way that he has escalated the attacks during this period, particularly on civilian targets. You get that dreadful attack in Shumi on Palm Sunday. I don't see any indication yet at all that Putin is prepared to make any concessions whatsoever on his original war aim, which is to make Ukraine into a vassal state of Russia once again.
What you're describing, though, seems to point to the fact that Russia is on the back foot. But how can they be when they're launching new offensives?
Their advances on the battlefield have slowed significantly in the last 3 months. At the current rate of progress, it would take them 80 years to conquer Ukraine, if you put it like that. They are unable to amass a significant force which could break through Ukrainian lines in a serious way. What they're doing is they're sort of biting off very small sections of territory. And we've virtually got a frontline stalemate at the moment. So their advances don't necessarily listen to the propaganda, look at the facts on the battlefield. The situation militarily for Russia is not good. Okay, they retook the Kursk salient, but they did that largely in the 8 days when Trump suspended tactical intelligence support for the Ukrainians. So it actually showed the importance of American support for the Ukrainian situation. And it's important that that is maintained, because the Europeans can't replace that. They can't replicate it, not at the moment anyway.
And what about the minerals deal with America? We were led to believe by Zelensky that it was imminent, but this evening President Trump is now saying that it won't be until next Thursday.
Well, it keeps on being negotiated. It's a very tough deal for Ukraine. They haven't got much choice. They're going to have to accept something. I think they're trying to make it a more reasonable document. I haven't seen the details, but it's clearly part of the pressure that Trump has used to get Ukraine to express its support for a ceasefire. I mean, Ukraine's it's terrible to say it. That's pretty much putty in American hands. I mean, America can call the shots, but they can't, at the moment, apparently call the shots with Putin, so they've only got one side to the table. And I haven't seen what the outcome of these talks are in Paris yet. There's you always get encouraging statements when they're ongoing, but we don't know the content. I mean, I certainly haven't seen it tonight yet.
But certainly in terms of any negotiations that are ongoing, you believe that Russia has the upper hand?
Well, Russia is being allowed the upper hand by the Trump administration at the moment. But in practice, the irony is that Putin probably needs a ceasefire pretty badly. The point is we need to sustain the Ukrainian war effort and maybe push this so that Russia is nearer to a point of crisis. But neither side is in a good position. And to look at Russia and think that there's imminent military victory, I think is quite misleading. It's not like that at all.
Can we talk about China and the current relationship with the UK? Are you comfortable with the level of Chinese involvement in our critical infrastructure? And I'm thinking about the reported access to UK medical records, patients' GP records.
Look, absolutely not. Why on earth are we allowing an autocratic communist state with whom we have difficult relationship involvement in aspects of our CNI, critical national infrastructure? I think the issue with the Scunthorpe Steelworks has shown how difficult a Chinese partner in that can be. And the idea that we would allow medical records in the hands of a Chinese company seems to me absurd. I really do feel that these are not areas of our economy where we should accept Chinese investment. Look, we've been around this circuit once already with Huawei and 5G. And at the beginning of that negotiation, we had statements from the government then saying, oh, we could manage the security. I'm pleased to say that given the pressure that some of us put on the government, that position has changed significantly, and we switched policy. I think the government should have some sort of committee which could be multi-party with some professional intelligence people who could, as it were, develop a clear line with China so we didn't put in their hands bits of our economy which might in future make us vulnerable. I mean, for example, China is supporting Putin very significantly in Ukraine. What would happen if there is a Taiwanese blockade or invasion, a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan? What then for the pressure that China could exercise in the UK, because they have a significant position in a critical part of our economy? It's just, for me, absolutely unthinkable. And we have to do something about it urgently.
So the government decision regarding Scunthorpe, that was the best option?
I think they did exactly the right thing. And I wouldn't normally support nationalisation, but I think if they nationalise the company, so much the better. Look, the equation has changed. We need high-grade steel. We need to manufacture it ourselves because of the emphasis now on rearmament across NATO countries. And that it absolutely should not be a Chinese company that owns that national asset.
But does the decision at Scunthorpe, does that spoil future relations with China?
Well, it may do, but tough. Look, we should have a relationship with China which is reciprocal. Do you really think the Chinese would allow us to own bits of their CNI? No way. Do you think that the Chinese would allow us to analyze data about the health of their population? No way. We should trade with China. I don't have any problem with that. And our economies, to an extent, are already intertwined by investment. But we should be very, very careful about the areas where we allow this sort of access. And the Chinese are never going to allow us reciprocity in our trading relationship with them. The government needs to wise up and to understand the situation. Many of these mistakes were made a significant time ago. We're now suffering the consequences. And some of us, right from the word go, were speaking out against these sorts of investment.
Should our ministers be visiting China, do you think?
Yes, I don't have any problem with that. You know, there's no problem having a dialogue with China. In fact, I would encourage a dialogue. Professionally, when I was in office, I went to China myself. It's important to try to reach better understanding with countries with whom we have difficult relations, which could escalate into something more serious. So the Chief of Defence Staff going there, good idea. Ministers going there, good idea. But don't dance to a Chinese tune. I mean, for example, the sort of visit that worries me is the one recently carried out by the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, his third visit to China in 18 months. And he comes back singing China's praises and saying Spain is a special partner of China. No way, that is dangerous. We need to be much more pragmatic, much clearer-minded, and to have a very clear multi-party policy on how we manage our relationship.
What are your thoughts on the allegation that China bought British steel with the specific aim to actually sabotage it?
I don't go, that's a sort of conspiracy theory I don't go along with. When they bought it, the price of energy was much cheaper, and probably it was a good investment if you took a more globalized view of the economy. The terms of that equation have changed completely, largely because of the impact on energy prices of the invasion of Ukraine. And look, if you go back politically, we had a different and more liberal attitude towards trading with China. Remember Cameron and Osborne when they were in office, and taking, a party of 50 senior businessmen there. And in a way, there are aspects of that visit which are fine, but it's the strategic bits of the economy where we've come to regret the degree of Chinese involvement. But talking to the Chinese, I don't have a problem with that. We should be talking to them.
What you're describing, is it fair to say that it amounts to a sort of decoupling from China? And if so, aren't we too far in to do that?
No, we can't decouple from China because it's a too complicated. This isn't the Cold War. It isn't like the sort of separation of the Soviet Russian economy from the European economies. There is too much linkage and integration, but we need to be very clear-minded and very strategic and also forensic about where we rely on a relationship with China and where we don't. Now, it's a complicated challenge for policymakers in Whitehall, but it's not an impossible challenge. And if we have our eyes open and we understand the risk and we handle it properly, we can, as it were, trade with the Chinese, but not make ourselves very vulnerable if the relationship with China seriously deteriorates, which it may well in the coming months or years ahead.
Finally, I just want to ask you about the Chagos Islands deal and whether you're happy with the deal that has been reached and seemingly approved by Donald Trump.
I'm very unhappy with it. And I just don't see why, when you own the freehold of a property, you suddenly turn around and decide to pay a heavy rent for it, particularly when you've got the predatory eyes of China looking at that part of the Indian Ocean. Look, it's an appalling deal. The indications are that the Trump administration, much to my disappointment, have accepted it, but they haven't formally accepted it. And certainly, in terms of my private conversations with some of the members of the administration, they don't like the deal either, because of I won't go into the legal complexities, but it's not based on anything, and it's an advisory opinion from the ICJ. It's not an enforceable opinion. And I might just point out that two of the judges on the court, one was Chinese and one was Russian.